It's not, I want to make clear that I'm not talking about that there really are these, incorporeal cosmic intelligences that we're communicating
Yeah.
with. What I'm saying is that the condition of finding yourself in an I-thou relationship
Wow.
in psychedelic space, to me, indicates another dimension of healing, which relates to something else you talked about earlier, particularly talking about with both depressed people and anxious people, there's a sense of disconnection from the world.
My name is Jason Silva, and this is Flow Sessions. Flow Sessions is a series of mind-stretching conversations exploring the intersection of culture, art, technology, and altered states of consciousness. What does it mean to be human in an age of rapid change? What is the future of psychotherapy and mental health? What role will technologies play in our cultural evolution? What are the cognitive benefits of awe and wonder? Flow Sessions is presented by Flowcana, California's leading sustainable cannabis brand, working with independent craft farmers to transform agriculture the California way.
Erik Davis is an American writer, scholar, journalist, and public speaker whose writings have ranged from rock criticism to cultural analysis to creative explorations of esoteric mysticism. He is perhaps best known for his dazzling book, TechGnosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, as well as his work on California counterculture, including Burning Man, the Human Potential Movement, and the writings of Philip K. Dick. Please welcome the one and only Erik Davis. Erik Davis.
Jason, how's it going, man?
Dude, it's so good. I'm so thrilled to have you here. As you know, I'm a longtime fan and just appreciate your mind and the rigorous, dazzling way in which you approach the great mysteries of consciousness. And I just often turn to your writing when I want to find the language to articulate something ineffable.
Wonderful. That's the space I like to inhabit.
You know, you are one of the virtuosos of the articulation of the ineffable. And so many of the stuff you've written about altered states of consciousness, these are spaces that are characterized by their ineffability. I mean, people say they have mystical experiences, and one of the hallmarks of mystical experience is that it is fundamentally ineffable or paradoxical, and it just can't be languaged. You had to be there. And I can appreciate that maybe empirical language doesn't always do justice to the experience unless you're Erik Davis, but I think that what you do beautifully is that you can bring a sort of rigor to these domains and a languaging to these domains while acknowledging what is fundamentally poetic and where the limitations of empiricism lie in trying to assimilate or understand or bring into language or bring into time and into coherence that which is fundamentally on the other side of the lines and beyond the day-to-day.
Yeah, well, the word beyond is key. I mean, that's something I talk about in High Weirdness in particular. I sort of say, throughout this book, I'm going to refer to the beyond or the outside, sometimes the other, which is a little different because sometimes the other has a sort of personality that the beyond and the outside don't. But I explicitly say I'm going to leave these things sort of undefined because they're more like gestures or they're more like attitudes, acknowledgments, even a little bit of a bow towards these zones and just proceed as if we all recognize that there are things that are outside our understanding, outside our language, and that we can get close to them or engage them, encounter them. That's a term I like a lot, encounter, because it doesn't mean you understand them. It doesn't mean you've grasped them, but there's still some point of contact.
Yeah.
And whether you can entirely language that or not, it doesn't almost matter to me. It's more about proceeding with a certain humility that however carefully you
Yeah.
use empirical language
Yeah.
or however evocatively use poetic language.
Yeah.
That neither of them are really going to totally cut the mustard. And that's just the condition we're in, a condition ultimately I celebrate. And I think a lot of people that's they resist that. They don't want to.
So you think everything is an approximation or an attempt at representing, an attempt at cohering and bringing into language, but you're saying even empirical accounts of the world can never be fully 100% representational of what they describe.
Sure, absolutely. No, the representation falls apart in a larger encounter with something that's ultimately a mystery.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I've been thinking about recently. I don't know. I've always distrust the idea you can kind of divide people into two camps, but I do think you can divide certainly intellectuals into camps, and one of them, one camp is the one that really believes that is so invested in articulation and analysis and understanding and the development of knowledge, and if they're scientists, in creating shared bodies of knowledge that move farther and farther into the unknown and bring it into the known. They're so invested in that they don't even really believe in that we should talk about something like the great mystery of things. That's sort of like a gross, it's almost repulsive. Like the whole point is it's not a mystery if you understand it. There are things we don't know, but that we'll know them eventually.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a lot of us, probably people who are more interested in poetry and spirituality and music and aesthetics and things, where you're like, no, there's a big mystery at the heart of this whole thing. Like, why is it here in the first place?
Yeah.
What is consciousness? What's inspiring me? And while I'm really interested in analysis and knowledge and different forms of attempting to understand the situation, I very much remain sort of in awe of the unfolding mystery, and I believe it's endless.
Yeah.
And since it's endless, we might as well begin developing a relationship with the endless, with the outside, with the beyond, and let that come in.
But grappling with the so-called unknowable causes a lot of existential disquiet, particularly in the Western rationalist mindset. You explored this brilliantly in your book, TechGnosis, when I first discovered you. Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information. On the one hand, it's a book about technology and technology's capacity to help us overcome problems and creating scientific instruments that can help us know the world and wire the world and cognitize the world with artificial intelligence and all of these dazzling Silicon Valley technologies on the one hand, and then you also illustrate how underneath this hyper-rational engineering, mathematical understanding of the world are the mystery still is hidden underneath, the yearning for transcendence, the yearning for immortality, the yearning for telepathy and omniscience, and all of these things there they are, they're maybe like on the shadow side, but there they are nonetheless. And so you think this is a fundamentally human thing, that it's just going to follow us no matter how successful the Western rationalist materialist understanding or account of things is, that the human mystery is going to follow everywhere?
I don't know about everywhere. I mean, I'm comfortable. I'm enough of a pluralist that I can believe that some people really inhabit a kind of fully rationalized world where their emotions, how they deal with problems, how they deal with the unknown, how they make decisions, can be so rationalized that then in some sense they're just sort of operating in this kind of efficiency, productivity, knowledge-based mode.
Yeah.
And for them, there maybe are no real mysteries. There's just problems that haven't been solved yet. And that's their kind of existential world. I think that is, a very unusual way to be compared to the way most human beings are, where we still are in these mysteries and ambiguities, these patterns of desire and imagination where, our dreams can still knock us on our ass, and we wake up the next day and we're like, wow, I'm different now because I dreamt that I encountered this god, or I was flying, or the beavers were talking to me, or whatever the sort of imaginal experience is. It still really changes most of us.
One of the things that I struggle with is grappling with what feels like different types of truth. And, I guess I find some comfort in, when the Greeks talk about chronos and kairos, so that there's two modes of describing the experience of time. There is sort of mechanized cognition, consensus time, empirical time. And I use the example of like a movie. So a movie theater might be in chronos, empirically, 2 hours and 20 minutes running time from the outside. But kairos, which is the realm of the timeless, consciousness that exists outside of time, dream consciousness, liminal consciousness, that you can be watching a movie and from the inside have an experience that is completely timeless, completely transformative, and fundamentally occurs way beyond 2 hours and 20 minutes of external running time. Or this notion that mythology is false from the outside or true from the inside, or that art is the lie, but the lie that reveals the truth, or that sometimes fiction is more truthful than reality. Jordan Peterson has become very famous for grappling with some of these questions around religious truth or archetypal truth. Carl Jung also was interested in archetypes and these realms. And so people are saying, yeah, but what do you mean? Like, how can something be archetypally true? Like, is it true or is it not true? Is a myth true? I'm like, well, it's true, but did it happen? Well, not necessarily. Where do you stand on those two sides?
Those are great questions. I actually want to go back to the time example.
Yeah.
Because you use the word mode. You talk about there's different modes of time, and I like that kind of thinking. I like modal thinking. One of the authors that I really draw a lot from for high weirdness, and it was who also plays an important role in TechGnosis, is this French sociologist of science and philosopher Bruno Latour, and he wrote a very interesting book called The Modes of Existence. On the modes of existence. And his argument is that things exist in different modes. We are in a multiplicity of modes of reality. And so, an obvious example is, or an example that he uses that's important for my book is like Sherlock Holmes has a certain quality of agreed upon reality, a certain kind of consistency, has a certain kind or mode of existence. And what he calls is that this is the mode of fictions. So within the mode of fictions, Sherlock Holmes, you gotta give him some ontological weight. Right?
Yeah.
Now, from another perspective, in perspective of a different mode, that's not really adequate. And Latour doesn't pretend like he has all the modes wired. In fact, what he sort of encourages us is to recognize that the world is a multiplicity of modes of existence. And so to go back to your example, yes, the movie theater is an objective space, and if someone has a measurement device, we're going to get 2 hours and 20 minutes. And then that's part of an economy of like how then when you book the next one, blah, blah, blah.
To buy the ticket, it starts at a certain time, it ends at a certain time.
All that.
Yeah.
And
right.
there is this sort of evocative mode of fiction that allows within it different kinds of experience and different modes of time, let's say, to coexist. And when you just go, if it's the case that reality is multiple, fundamentally multiple, then a lot of these problems kind of disappear because you're like, yes, and yes, and yes, and.
But what comes to mind then is we avoid problems as long as we can draw lines between the modes. Just like we have a separation between church and state. That would be the separation between the empirical and the poetic, or the literal and the mythic, because state would be the movie is 2 hours and 20 minutes running time. It's rated R. You go to this movie theater at this time. You don't turn your phone on during it. Those are the rules of the state. Church would be, that movie is the truth of how I want to live my life, and now everybody should follow me. No. That movie told you the truth about how you should live your life. And as long as you're not hurting anybody else and not imposing that truth on anybody else, we're fine. And you can take this out of the example of the movie theater and bring it to everything, You could bring it to the psychedelic renaissance, objectively, well, okay, material molecules that we ingest that in fMRI scans, which is an instrument we use to look inside the brain, it looks like a part of the brain that we think controls the autobiographical sense of self gets kind of dissipated, and that by shutting that down, different parts of the brain talk to each other. And it seems to do according to the neuroscientist, the guy from Robin Carhart Harris, it's an effect akin to shaking the snow globe from like obsessive looping patterns that don't serve you anymore, that are so often characterized in issues with depression and anxiety and OCD and all this stuff. And so that's like an objective state account of why psychedelics might work. The experience of shaking the snow globe in the brain, dampening the default mode network for 5 to 6 hours in a safe environment allows the person to see themselves and see the world from a distinctly different vantage point, and that maybe allow them to finally dispense or metabolize these patterns of thought that have been so ingrooved that don't serve them anymore. That's state. Separate that from church. Church is, I fucking trip balls. I saw the universe. I became one with everything. I realized that death is an illusion, that we're all eternal, and now I'm going to like sit in cacao ceremonies and wear funny hats, and like all is good in the world. But the problem is when that person has that experience, a church experience, and then wants to become the shaman and wants to tell everybody else what to believe about their own interior experience.
Yeah,
so because this is the problem nowadays between
totally a problem.
Saying you're entitled to your opinion but not to your own facts. Maybe a better way of saying that is you are entitled to your own poetic facts, but you're not entitled to your own empirical facts. You're entitled to your own church, but not to your own state, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, one way the problem then is recognizing which mode you're in for any given situation or any given problem, and what are the appropriate tools for that mode.
Yes.
And that's where people have a lot of trouble, because I think it's partly because people aren't really embracing this multiplicity approach.
Right.
Because it's sort of scary, because people go, oh, that's just postmodernism. You think everything is relative. Oh, it's and then it's the problem of relativism. And I'm like, no, that's not quite right. It's not quite right, because there are better and worse tools to bring to any particular mode.
Yes.
And if you over time in experience and through pedagogy and through tradition and through innovation and through new tools and all of those things, we come up with we have this huge tool belt, but we're very poor at recognizing what tools are appropriate for what modes, or even acknowledging that there are different modes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I find somehow, and I have a lot of friends who fall into one or the other. They're the ones that are just allergic to anything church-like or spiritually language-like, that mode, and they're like fully Western empirical. And then I have others that are like, how can I live without the spiritual dimension of life? And science is arrogant, and science is scientism, and so on and so forth. And for me, somehow, intuitively, I've never had a problem with compartmentalizing the different modes. And that kind of compartmentalization, it just kind of makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. It's like that scene from Dead Poet Society when Robin Williams is saying, huddle up, and he says, engineering, science, mathematics, these are noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, love, this is what we stay alive for. And ultimately, poetry, truth, love, or at least poetic truth, these are kairos. These are church, But state should be engineering, science, mathematics, the noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. There is the division. Or Ursula Le Guin, she says, science describes accurately from the outside. Poetry describes accurately from the inside. Mm-hmm. Science explicates. Poetry implicates.
Well, one of the things that you're also talking about there is that you're not just making a distinction between science and other human pursuits, but you're using this balance of state and church. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really key, because one of the ways of saying what's happening to politics now, and I don't want to dive into the whole shebang, but just to make some meta comments about it, is that I remember very distinctly a friend of mine he was British, and it's kind of a British attitude, although they're not living by it at all any more than we are in the States. But he said, the thing about politics and politicians is that it should be really boring. Mm-hmm. It should be boring.
That's right.
It should be this sort of instrument of attempting to deal with different demands and navigate to the best you can given the situation. That it should be kind of procedural, pragmatic, not poetic.
That's right.
But what's happening now is that the poetry, and it's not very good poetry.
No, it's not.
But it is poetry.
That's right.
Is now in the heart of the state.
It's grotesque.
Like it's so we have these.
I would call it like circus poetry, reality show poetry, but it's still poetry in that it's fucking fiction and plays with language and plays.
It's not good poetry, but it is like calling up, old archetypes. It's like you can see the archetypes, and conspiracy theory is another example of this. Conspiracy theory is where you take the operations of historical thinking that involved, empirical facts, dominant discussions, including the possibility that these are not all correct and that there are things we're not acknowledging, but that's all part of conventional historical thinking. So you take the engine of historical thinking, and then you inject all these, let's call them, poems or fictions or visions or this internal realm stuff.
That's right.
Where you have, good and evil fighting battles at the end of time. And that's all. And so then they're mushed together and distributed. And with the collapse of authority, they just are raging. I mean, oh my God, that stuff is
that's
potent.
That's the fucking problem that we're having today. The porousness between the modes is making everybody really fucking confused, there's another quote, this guy, Alain de Botton out of the UK, I love him, and he had this line that I loved where he said, whereby a poem may be less accurate, and I'm paraphrasing, a poem is less accurate in describing the details of an event than a journalist's account of said event. The poem may nevertheless reveal truths of a deeper sort, so that the journalistic account of it is more of a naive realism, but that the poem reveals truth of a deeper sort beyond the literal grid. But then, fine. But then we should distinguish the grids. Church and state, the literal grid and the poetic grid, the science grid and the mythopoetic grid. And I live for the mythopoetic. I live for the fucking timeless. The art I make are meant to explore beautiful ideas, but I put a big fucking parentheses around that, and I'm like, I'm making art. I'm not calling it anything other than art, And the importance of that is because when I play in the mythopoetic, I distinctly want to be outside of the default world. And as long as that line is super crisp, I can just be a playful and creative person versus a psychotic person.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. No, it's true. It's really respecting the difference between the modes. And that was something that was always, like you, it was just my temperament. Like my father's a scientist. I thought I was going to study science. I studied a lot of mathematics. A lot of my good friends are technical people or hardcore materialist people. They're not. I know people who are spiritual practitioners. I know some religious people, but a lot of my friends are from that science zone. But I was always very, not even just comfortable, but drawn towards appreciating these different modes and for seeing how they relate, but also how there's a distinction between them. And to see that we're always negotiating, individually and culturally between the mythopoetic and the scientific.
That's right.
And I think, but again, I think you're right. One of the things that's happening now is just that it's so porous that it's like all the phantasms are now loosed in the consensus reality that had been more generated through these empirical historical processes.
Right.
And in a way, that's what I was talking about in TechGnosis. Is you have these rational technologies, you build these systems based on them. You think you're kind of chasing away religion as you install these new systems, because after all, the telegraph works better than the mystical invocation. So now everyone's going to go, well, I guess the guys who are making the telegraph kind of have they're the ones who get to say what reality is.
Totally.
But then the stuff slips in again. And it's not, unfortunately, it's not just a yen for wonder or yen for transcendence or for, the big cosmic view or the overview or whatever. It's also like good and evil. And so once you have evil, then you have demons, and you have demons manipulating, and then you have things behind the thing. And then and then there's another whole element I think that's happening is just the earth, the material world is also sort of losing its consistency as we enter into a period of climate change. So it's not just about the climate's going to become more challenging in all these political, ecological, physical ways. And there's, that's the elephant in the room. But it's also that the climate, that the weather that is our weather is shifting. And so it's fundamentally pulling, again, this sense of some kind of consistent consensus, some kind of agreed upon reality. And as that happens, I think there's also a sense of the kind of non-rational factors of being on a planet become more and more evident as well.
This is endlessly interesting to me, especially because on the one hand, I think there is an aspect of the human character that just existentially needs to believe in cosmic specialness, right? I don't know, it was Kafka who said man needs to believe there's something indestructible within himself. Or Dostoevsky talk about the importance of blasting new tunnels between the mind and the other. Like, we want to feel part of a larger whole. And on the one hand, well, we are, right? We're made of atoms that were cooked in the furnaces of stars, and Neil deGrasse Tyson says that makes him feel big, not small. So that's like an empirical truth. But also on a poetic level, we just want to feel like we matter. Existentially, we are fucking mortal beings. We can conceive of the infinite, but we watch ourselves age every single day. And the cognitive dissonance of that is horrific. And so we need meaning. And so we want meaning that has its own ontological grounding. We don't like the idea that we're creating the meaning, because then we caught up in the idea that we're just deluding ourselves. But this is a fundamental problem, enough that these fracturings that are happening now, where we don't have like the simple lie or the simple character as a vital lie of culture and religion, whether it was westernized or not, but that gave you a set way of things, that's getting increasingly fractured and porous and frazzled. And so it's leading to this so-called epidemic of mental distress. And fucking A, more people committing suicide now than are dying from natural disasters and armed conflict combined. And this is a United Nations number.
Wow.
More people than armed conflict and natural disasters combined are killing themselves nowadays per year.
That's extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so we need to figure out like what we believe and how we believe what we believe and what we think about what we believe and on what ontological layer it exists as truth. What are the myths that are true from the inside but false from the outside, and not to confuse those myths versus the facts that are true from the outside and from the inside, no matter how you look at them. But this is where now psychotherapy is deploying a sort of renaissance or rediscovering the material molecules that start to play with these domains, for better or for worse. And this is interesting because you have grappled with this, because I'm going to read you your own quote, because on the one hand, we know now that in controlled environments, whether it's Johns Hopkins University studies, NYU, Stephen Roth, Roland Griffiths, they're deploying psychedelic mushrooms, giving it to people who have profound existential anxiety that's not responding to traditional medication. And a single guided trip, if it ticks all the boxes of a mystical experience, the person is cured of their anxiety. So that's like objective. This experience, this molecule, a particular experience the person had, and they no longer meet the criteria of depression or anxiety, and they engage more with the world. So that's all quantifiable and true. That's enough to legalize these substances. That has epistemic value, so to speak. But then there's the fact that when people describe what they experienced, we can't fit it into our Western models of understanding of the world. I merged with the cosmos. I rose up outside my body. My spirit left. But on the one hand, the researchers are like, if we want to get this shit legalized, we don't want to go there. We don't want to ask about the truth from the inside. We only care about the truth from the outside and the measurable, quantifiable improvements in people's lives. And this is your line, and then you can unpack it for us if you like. We are sweeping such sublimities, the accounts of people merging with God when they have a psychedelic experience, under the rug of side effects, or so-called toxic side effects. The researchers and the partners in the industry are sidestepping or want to sidestep the remarkable paradox that psychedelic substances present to brain-based reductionists. Psychedelics are material molecules that frequently occasion experiences that look and feel for all the world like the sort of mystical or religious raptures whose unfolding cognitive content calls into question the strict materialism. In other words, these reductionist researchers of powerful psychedelics must still squirm before God, or at least before the experiential states that recall the ecstatic reports of mystics. So I always wanted to say that in a microphone. Thank you for that. But that idea, right, that here these scientists buttoned up wearing a suit have to convince the FDA that these molecules, you give it to a person in a controlled environment with therapy, and then we can quantifiably measure that these people are better and no longer meet the criteria for PTSD or depression or whatever. But we're not going to go into what the first person narrative of their experience was,
right,
you know. And
right.
so this is what's so interesting is like here we are going back to the separation of church and state, or inside and outside, or empirical truth versus poetic truth. It is the experience of poetic truth and rapture that seems to cause healing, that has a reality bleed-through effect, and has then empirical, quantifiable left brain, state measurable healing. How interesting is that?
It's totally amazing. It's really, really interesting. And you know, in a way, the proper pragmatic response is to sort of just bracket those experiences and say, and I mean, because they do acknowledge them to the extent that they have a checklist that's like, you know, the mystical experience report checklist that's been used for decades.
Totally, William James.
It goes, you know, and it's based on someone's interpretation of mysticism, which is very questionable from certain other angles. You know, there's a whole thing to be said about why is it that the unitive mystical experience, the all is one, and the sense of clarity and unity and sort of impersonal grandeur, why is that the apex of the triangle? What about, you know, there's you know, a whole immense continent of mystical experiences that involve the encounter with God, you know, the encounter with a loving, knowing personality or person that you have a relationship with of love, and the most profound relationship in your life. And that's not just a couple. That's huge. That's whole tradition. So what do we do with those? And then moving over, what do we do with like indigenous encounters with spirits of the forest? And who aren't that. They're not the great God on the top of the mountaintop, and they're not impersonal unity. They're like I-thou relationships with kind of trickster characters who may have something to tell you, and they you know, it's a whole other domain. Now,
like Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah, are we going to
exactly?
Are we going to say, well, that's low on the triangle, and the ones who think it's God, they just haven't quite seen what we've seen. And that's the thing is, if you look at the measure, the mystical measure that Johns Hopkins uses to tick off the box, so someone can come in and go, how was their mushroom experience? It was all right. They didn't get ineffable. They didn't get noetic. So, you know, maybe it's, and they claim that the more you check off these boxes, the more powerful and transformative the experience is. Okay, great. Maybe that's true. But if you ask why are these the boxes, it's a very historical question. And some people are like, you know, maybe at least for some people, those aren't the most important kinds of experiences you can have. And does this really account for the way indigenous people approach reality, the way that profoundly believing Christians or Muslims approach reality? And so even that is kind of like gets us sort of immediately into these sort of murky waters. But I really think that, I mean, it's just going to be very interesting to see, because as this stuff gets assimilated, which it clearly is going to, because there is this mental health crisis, because they haven't come up with anything since SSRIs in the early 1980s. Okay, and those they barely would even pass placebo. They might not even pass a placebo test today, the way they barely did back then. So we don't have much, and there's a crisis, as you're saying. I mean, it's no joke. So anything is good. And another little tricky factor that my friend Mike J, who's a historian of drugs as well as a historian of psychiatry, has been really clear about communicating. He just wrote a terrific book about mescaline, and he talks a little bit about this there, but is that if you look through the history of 20th century psychiatry, it's you find these hyped moments. We're like, oh my God, we finally figured out a way to deal with these huge, deep problems of human psychology. Things like lobotomies or electroshock therapy or Thorazine, and it's not just, this is the tricky part. It's not just that, well, there was a lot of hype around those things, and then we realized down the line that actually they only do so much good, although electroshock's coming back. And there's some reason to think that that's good and da-da-da. But what's trickier is that we're dealing with this weird realm between mind and matter, where there's an inside, in your terms, as well as an outside.
Yeah.
And so somewhat different rules apply. Right. And it may be the case that when you introduce a new therapy into society, and there's a new therapy, and now we're all doing the new therapy, that you actually do get more results. It really does look like a panacea. Like, oh my God, we got it. And then as the years go by, it becomes assimilated into the system, and it's the same guys, doing the thing, blah, blah. It doesn't work as well anymore. And that might have something to do with the way that a lot of psychological tests, when they retest them now, when psychological experiments, they seem to get a robust response, and then, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, somebody else, some other university does it again, doesn't work. That is epidemic in social psychology right now. So we don't know what the heck's going on at all. And so we get to see that happen with psychedelics now.
And I think that's the biggest, my intuition is that for now, as far as passing legislation to allow people to have legal access to these treatments in controlled environments, without window dressing the interior experience, let people have their interior experience. That's the only way we pass this into law, where we ignore the contents of the experience as long as the person's better. There are these cognitive philosophers out of Australia. One of them is called Chris Letheby. I don't know if I send you that article in Aeon. It was called Psychedelics Work by Violating Our Expectations of Mind and World. And these guys, they're cognitive philosophers, so they are materialists. They believe that consciousness resides in a material brain, and therefore that all the stuff that happens during a psychedelic experience is originating in a material brain. But they still believe that psychedelic experience can, even though they call into question strict materialism, that doesn't matter, because what they believe is that what matters is their epistemic value, in that if a person has an experience, right, where they encounter, in the words of these guys, an experience of knowledge by acquaintance versus knowledge by description, that then has quantifiable, better results where the person is engaging with the world more because they're not anxious or depressed anymore, which means they do more things in the world, and then we've effectively treated them. And that's all that matters. And this was very interesting because, they say that the diseases of anxiety, the mental health diseases of anxiety, of depression, of OCD, that they all share this similar rigidity of thought. So if we have the famous lenses of perception or the lenses of expectations, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, and we see with our lenses and through our lenses, but we don't always see the lenses themselves. So they talk about the example of somebody who's in the throngs of a depressive psychosis or somebody who's really anxious. So you can grab a depressed person who's like, I hate my life, I hate my job, it's all hopeless, and I'm like, dude, let's just get you on a plane and go to Cape Town. And let's fucking take you surfing. You've never surfed. Let's teach you how to surf for a week, Let's smoke a joint and go on safari. Let's have you encounter the elephants during golden hour in the middle of the safari. Let's see what happens. And then, that sounds awful. It's going to be boring. Because you assume that you're going to take yourself with you wherever you go. Because knowledge by description can't reach somebody who is so blindsided by their filters of perception at this moment. But that psychedelics can engender an experience of knowledge by acquaintance. Acquaintance is the felt experience, the poetic experience where, your modes of perception are obliterated in McKenna's quaking, annihilating glory. It's you can't rationalize away in the moment the profundity or the intensity of these psychedelic experiences. And so that's knowledge by acquaintance. It's akin to lifting the depressed person and placing them somewhere else. So by actually viscerally experiencing another place from which to plant their feet, it seems to make you aware of your own lenses. That's the line they use. That psychedelics have this magical capacity of taking the lenses that you see through and with and making you actually see the lenses. And that the moment of true catharsis and integration is once you've seen the lenses, you can go, whoosh, get rid of them. They don't serve me anymore. And then create new interpretive frameworks. So that they sidestep going into the debate about the metaphysical or ontological truth of the contents of the experience, because they're like, ultimately what matters is that you had a profound encounter with a different way of seeing things that finally dissipated those rigid patterns of thinking. And that, I mean, I thought that was an interesting.
I think that's a great. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to go into the metaphysical questions. I think that there is something strange that happens if you try to ignore the sacred dimension that people experience, or the way that they experience it. That there's particularly something strange about the question of entities. To me, that's where things get really interesting. So if you have a impersonal, I'm one with the cosmos moment, great. But what if you're in that space and then suddenly you're aware that you're actually part of a panel of entities from around the cosmos, and you're all sort of sitting around this cosmic table kind of looking at each other and recognizing that nobody knows what's going on, but we're all kind of in this room together. Suddenly there's a quality of relationship that appears in that. And lots of psychedelic experiences have these, as well as experiences of profound unity. But they're much, much more strange, difficult to talk about, and that's, one of the themes in High Weirdness is that these three guys that I'm talking about, Robert Anton Wilson, Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, that they all encounter in the midst of all of these different dimensions and science fictional operations and rushes of energy, they encounter these sort of entities. And now is there an epistemic value to that? I think there is.
Well, it's like people who who talk to aliens that tell them what to do, whatever. As long as the aliens are telling you to be kind to thy neighbor, fine. But if the voices in your head are telling you to shoot up a schoolyard, then that's the problem. My problem is when as soon as you start talking about entities, I start to worry about what's the difference between this and a schizophrenic who hears voices. And
it's very, very difficult to make that distinction. I mean, I have James Kent, who's a longtime psychedelic researcher and does Dose Nation podcast. He just did this withering critique of psychedelic culture, and in one of his episodes he talks about how like he tells a story of like these buddies who like took some mushrooms, and one of them ended up like chopping the other guy's heart out with a knife, and then the cops come and he's all covered with blood. And he said, "Oh, he was a demon or whatever." And then you're like, "Okay, well, whatever told him that was the case, whatever spirit, if you're going to say, well, no, that's psychotic, where do you draw the line?"
100%. And my intuition, man, and again, this might be because I like to. I like to entertain wild ideas, but in the end, Occam's razor, right? Like I'm really, the idea of set and setting, and the idea that psychedelic trips are constructed by a culture, set, and expectation rings very true to me.
Me too.
So, a Christian might have a psychedelic experience and actually see Jesus. An indigenous person might see the trickster spirits in the forest, because that's kind of the stories they grew up with that have been seeded into their subconscious. And if psychedelics are ultimately nonspecific amplifiers of consciousness, or gateways to the unconscious, or patterns of mind and thought that are disinhibited from the handshake that we make every day between our projections and illusions and the world that we encounter, and as long as that, when that handshake is okay, like I can sprinkle some magical thinking on the world that I am special and that I am here to do cool things and this and that. As long as that handshake's okay with the feedback I'm receiving, then I'm a well-adjusted person. As soon as I'm sprinkling magical thinking that is incongruent with the world that I'm encountering every day, now I start to be a person that has pathologies, of some sort.
Or a following. That's what I mean.
Well, right. That's the difference between a crazy person and a genius. The genius has an audience, like people follow him, and then they create That's when somebody can lose out of touch. They get too famous and too many yes people around them, and they literally like now have a handshake with a different reality that they encounter.
But I want to get back to the entity thing because I want to finish my thought, which
please.
is it's not. I want to make clear that I'm not talking about that there really are these, incorporeal cosmic intelligences that we're communicating with. What I'm saying is that the condition of finding yourself in an I-thou relationship in psychedelic space, to me, indicates another dimension of healing, which relates to something else you talked about earlier, particularly talking about with both depressed people and anxious people, there's a sense of disconnection from the world.
That's right.
So what does it mean to be connected to the world? What does it mean to be connected to the world, not in the usual Western tool using manipulative agent mode where like I'm going out in the world to satisfy my desires and achieve power, and I'm going to manipulate the situation. Or what does it mean to relate to the world not in that mode?
It's to have the I thou.
It's a It's a relational situation. So for me,
intersubjective.
The entity is a mark of a model of relationality that applies to completely ordinary situations. Our relationships to other people, our relationships to the material conditions that we actually live in, to the material institutions, but particularly to the planet. And to be able to appreciate that there's a tremendous value in the I thou in terms of mutual responsibility, in terms of thinking in terms of systems rather than in terms of human desires alone, so that actually that agent encounter, that entity encounter is kind of like an initiation into a different way of relating that ties us back in. And it's not easy because we're being tied into a situation that's incredibly challenging right now. It's not like, I'm one with the universe, then great, that's happy, I guess, for you. Wonderful. But like if I'm one with the planet, it's like the planet's like, whoa, this thing, the people, a lot of creatures, whole worlds are dying.
That's right.
There's plastic everywhere, the whole thing. So it's not, there's something sobering about it too. And I think that what's happening is that the stories, the fantasies, the phantasms are so appealing, and they're so much more easy to deal with than handling the complexities of reality, that people get sucked into them. But that still that I-thou relationship is a really key doorway towards the kind of relationality that both allows us to feel connected to the world, but also allows us to feel responsible for the world and to recognize that we are profoundly embedded. We're not just solo Western tool using agents who are using technology to get ahead. And that's such a dominant mode of experience in our reality now. So even the crazy stuff, I think, points towards things that are profound.
Yeah. Well, and then grappling with the crazy stuff, or experiences that on the one hand you have undergone, but that fall outside the scope of understanding, or you cannot account for them using the normal ways of accounting for reality than you're used to, raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, we're looping around to what we talked about initially, because for me, when I one of the stories I have is like, okay, my book, what is it about? Basically, that psychedelics may be healing, they may be even sacred or profound, but they're also really fucking weird. And what does that mean? It means we don't know what's going on. You're in a place that it's uncomfortable, it's strange, it's a little bit ominous. It seems it's not just you, it's like there's something about the thing itself that you don't really get. And to me, that's a really important, beautiful emotion. And not just emotional, like a mode of relating to the fact that there's always more than you can fit into your system, that the world is larger than any of your maps and models, and that perhaps right now, even in particular, we are, even though it's difficult and a lot of people are running in the opposite direction, that those of us who can take it, we need to expand into increasingly uncomfortable spaces of recognizing what's going on, including the profound discomfort of recognizing that it's so complicated that there's no way we can understand what's going on, and really to be in that. And I'm increasingly think that one of the great gifts of psychedelics, particularly bigger experiences, is that sometimes you're totally confused. And you learn that actually you can move through that. You can maneuver in total confusion, but that it's actually really helpful to become intimate with total confusion. You can't make decisions from there, but you also can't make decisions adequately if you believe that your story that you're holding on to master the fears of total confusion is the only way, because that's what we're seeing now. Everyone's retreating from the complexity, just the sheer complexity of our moment into these stories because it's too terrifying. So,
but it is too terrifying.
Well, but then grab the terror. then part of psychedelics is it's a terror show.
Yeah,
and you get some dark stuff in there.
They dissolve perhaps the necessary ontological ground, and we need some mode, some place from which to operate from. Otherwise, we can't fetch water or chop wood. I mean, it's really hard. One thing is to say you're living with the mystery when you're just using a word or you're just saying, I don't know. Something else is encountering the incoherent complexity of the mystery and feel that incoherence viscerally and then feel like, wow, I'm drowning in a sea of confusion, and that's pretty fucking scary. I'm reminded a lot of, you ever see the movie Contact?
Oh, yeah.
Jodie Foster,
yeah,
based on the Carl Sagan book. So I love the end of that film very much because I watched that film and I think it's a wonderful meditation between science and religion. You know, Jodie Foster plays Ellie Arroway. She's an astronomer. She's a materialist, but she's also a wonder junkie. So like Sagan, you know, she looks at the cosmos with a sacred awe, but she uses mathematics to understand it, you know. And then she's dating the Matthew McConaughey character who's essentially a priest. And he's just like, I can't imagine the world without God, you know. And then the sort of climax of the film, for those who haven't seen it, is, you know, they get a message from space, and it has all this mathematical equation that they figure out, supposedly from the intelligent aliens, to build a vessel. And then it builds, they build this contraption that spins, and the idea is that it creates a vortex in space-time. And then the capsule is meant to be dropped through the vortex, and they think that it's going to get slingshotted across the universe. So now Jodie Foster is in it. You know, she's built this thing with alien technology. I mean, it's like you have like a cognitive orgasm in anticipation of what you're gonna find, you know. And then they drop her through it, and you get the camera angle from outside the ship, and it shows that it's released into the vortex. But then we cut to her own experience. So now we're inside the ship with her. She's wearing a handheld or a head-mounted camera, and we see her, I guess, ultimately her experience. And her experience is that the thing opens a wormhole. She goes to the other side of the universe, freaking witnesses celestial events, meets the aliens who incarnate as a virtual reality rendering of her father in her childhood beach to tell her everything is going to be okay. And there's a mystery, a grand mystery we will never know. Small steps, Ellie, which is what her dad used to tell her. And then we cut back to the outside camera showing that the ship fell right through the vortex, didn't go anywhere, was on camera the whole time except for a microsecond of interference. And now she is like, what year is it? I went. No. And the whole movie up until this point, she's mocked religious people for their encounters with the mystery. And now she has to sit in front of a panel of scientists and say, I had an experience. I went across the galaxy. I met the alien. But as a scientist, I have to concede I might have just bumped my head and hallucinated the whole thing. You have an inside-outside dichotomy. And if the movie ended there, that would already be a brilliant, frustrating end of the mystery because, you know, you're rooting for her. You saw her have the experience. You believe her until you, like her, has to concede, well, hey, that sounds like a fucking thing that she imagined. But then the last scene is they take her head-mounted camera and they're like, oh, it only recorded static. But then they're like, well, that's not the concern that it just recorded static, but that it recorded 15 hours of static, even though she went through that thing in 5 seconds. So then the director's basically wink, wink, saying, okay, look, it was a wormhole. It folded space-time and shit can get weird. You know, relativity and the warping of space-time could be a way of like groping at physics to make sense of ineffable things. So psychedelics warp space-time and you go into other dimensions and the whole thing. But I wonder like what you make of like an end of a film like that, because could they both be true? Could it have been a space-time thing when the aliens are what exists in the other dimensions of consciousness? Or did she hallucinate the whole thing? Or is it a material thing? Is it a poetic truth? Is it a religious truth? Is it church? Is it state? Like, how do you grapple with that?
Well, I mean, I'm comfortable with the idea that part of reality that there are edges of reality, whatever, I'm going to leave it momentarily undefined, that are anomalous, that there are anomalies, that anomalies are part of reality. Now, that doesn't mean that the anomaly is pointing to necessarily a whole other order of existence. So if we look at the 15 hours on the camera as an anomaly, that shouldn't have been there. We just saw her go through there. That's an anomaly. What do we do with it? And my attitude is that even if you're able to kind of explain away certain anomalies eventually, they're just going to keep coming. So it's less about that certain anomalies are pointing towards a certain story. Oh, there's actually this other dimension that does this and that. That to me is a little bit of a wild goose chase. And that more to the point is that anywhere we look, if we're really paying attention, we're going to see some anomalies. Whether it's in fairy lore, whether it's in prophetic dreams, whether it's, it's like these things are there. They're like sparkle, scattered throughout. And I think that they are there to always remind us of the limitations of our given reality construct, that there's cracks in the construct, but that sort of letting the crack erode your total conviction in your worldview is probably more important than attempting to see through it to get to exactly the next order of the explanation. And that just tends to be the way that I react to those kinds of things. There's another interesting thing about Contact, if I remember correctly, is that they're trying to build the machine in the States, but there's a crazy Christian who
blows himself
terrorists
up.
or whatever.
Yeah.
And then we go to the east,
Yeah.
and there's a shot of Jodie Foster in her hotel room, and in the back you see an enso, which is the Zen Buddhist circle that sort of means emptiness or nothing.
Oh, interesting. I
So
don't remember that.
even though McConaughey is, clearly a Christian preacher guy, there's also a critique of like the God concept, and it's almost like you have to go through this kind of Buddhist notion of emptiness, no God, nothing holy, to get to the encounter. And I thought that was a really interesting little bit of the movie.
That reminds me of when you wrote about the Matrix, and you talk about the Neo melting into the mirror and undergoing the mystic psychotic collapse, and then having to walk in the Bardos before the world recreates itself, like the Bardos after the pixelating wake of like fully dematerializing or disappearing or dying, and then being in the bar of the nothing before something else emerges. I mean, it seems like that's a pretty interesting parallel.
I think that that's related to this idea of the crack. It's like, oh, it's just a construct. Can we just stay with it's just a construct instead of going immediately to, well, it's a construct because these other forces are creating this other story, and behind the construct is this other order of power, and this is what's actually happening. Everybody wants to go there. What does it mean to just be like, wow, it's a construct. The rug I'm standing on is on nothing. Yeah. And that's it. Be in that moment. The example that I'm thinking of. This is something I've been like kind of practicing for a while. Is like I like to take naps. I like to do what my wife Jennifer Dumper calls liminal dreaming, meaning like to kind of surf on the edges of awake and asleep, going kind of into this beginning of the dream realm, but I'm not quite asleep, and you just kind of play with that a lot. And one of the things I've been teaching myself is when you wake up from a nap. I mean, you wake up any place, but or if you're traveling or whatever, it happens a lot. There's a little moment where you don't know where you are.
Once in a while it happens.
Right, once in a while.
Very rarely, but it was very scary. The
right,
one time
right.
it happened, I was very frightened.
Yeah, so
because
what
I actually had to think really strong.
Right, but what I've taught myself to do is when I have that, including that shock, instead of trying to figure it out, I just remain in the not knowing where I am. And it just, boom, it just explodes. Really? It's a very beautiful, strange intimacy with this not knowing, which is just one of my big themes, whether I'm talking about mystery, whether I'm talking about, well, we can't really say what the cosmic metaphysical reality is beyond these experiences, or whether I'm pointing out the way that different accounts of reality smash into each other and we can't really determine between them, is not a kind of not knowing where you throw up your hands and you stop trying to explain things. It's really becoming comfortable and intimate with the everyday experience of mystery, of being awake, of sitting across the table from the others and recognizing that nobody really ultimately knows what's going on, but at least we're having a really good conversation.
We're having a really good conversation.
We're working on it. You know what I mean? And,
Well, it's like that quote that says something like, "We're all falling through space. Nobody knows what the fuck is going on, but the good news, there is no ground." Something like that. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
yeah,
quote.
yeah. You know, I can relate with
But
that.
and I wonder sometimes. Okay, fine. Look, there's ineffable mysteries, or there's things that can be.
Can we F the ineffable?
Yeah, there's things that can be deconstructed, and there's things that can be explained. Like, when I watch a movie, I know, okay, this is 24 frames per second, creates the illusion of motion. These actors have memorized these lines. This has been edited together into a sequence of events that I can only make sense of because it operates the way my consciousness does, right? Attention represents the close-up, foreboding represents future projection, flashbacks represent the memory of the past, and that cinema is actually consciousness meets its own process when we watch movies. And the reason that we can have those experiences is because it mimics interiority more than empirical reality. And so then understanding that tells me, it's like, okay, so we are dual in our beingness. We exist in a consensus-like empirical reality to the degree that we can manipulate it so that airplanes take off and land and communicate with each other. And Shannon's theory of information makes it so that I can freaking do fucking FaceTime calls with a device made of plastic and metal and see other whatever. Like, there are mysterious things that we can still account for in that outside world. But then there are interior experiences, like my consciousness encountering a Chris Nolan film when I'm a little bit stoned in the theater, and I'm having a profoundly church-like, mythological, Joseph Campbell-esque, out-of-time, transfigurating experience that's seeding my consciousness with great truths that are going to then affect my behavior in the world, adjust my baseline and how I feel about life in general, and that I make friends enough with those two sides, those two modalities, a deeply spiritual, religious, mythical interior life, and with a grounding in an external reality that is infinitely complicated too, airplanes that fly and smartphones that video conference and our voice turning into electrical molecules being recorded by these cameras. And that's also true, and that they're both true, but they're just like. It's an analogy you could draw from physics. Newtonian physics on one scale, relativity physics on another scale, quantum physics on another scale. And different rules emerge on different scales. So you could also argue that different rules or principles or set of behaviors emerge in different modes. So we could sort of borrow that consolation from physics. I'm like, well, shit's just different on different scales. How about like reality is just different on different modes? I mean, yeah. What do you?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to find some kind of peace or resolution. Maybe there isn't any.
No. I mean, that's part of it. Is that is to grow comfortable with the possibility that we are in a zone within which multiple modes are operating, and that our desire that's based on science, that's based on the way our brains work, or it's based on language or whatever, to unify them or to dominate them with a particular story is going to be so challenged by the nature of the situation that it's much better to learn to bring the appropriate tool to the appropriate domain, to recognize that all domains are not one. They overlap.
Yeah.
They interact.
Sure.
It's not like a sky high wall by any means.
Right. Sure.
There's but
sometimes I can get high on cannabis and have a really good time, and then start feeling a little anxious in the trip, and then I realize I really have to pee.
Yeah.
And that would be an example of literally that happening. Like the domain of physical reality and me having a bladder that's full of urine that needs to go pee is spilling over into the trip, into the dream world. It's very similar to the movie Inception, plays with that metaphor.
It does.
Where it's like you can be dreaming, and if they pour water on you while you're dreaming, in the dream it starts to rain. So there's bleed-through effects between the modes.
Right.
And so accounting for that allows you to steward the experience you have in each of the modes.
Right. And then also to not become completely absorbed into any of them. For example, you can have your transcendental experience at the Hollywood cinema, but there's, sometimes there's arguments to be made that, those experiences are themselves part of a larger machinery of distraction that is very consciously deployed in order to keep a lot of the minds occupied. Oh yeah, give them their Joseph Campbell, Here with a Thousand Faces schlock to keep them all obsessed and in these little circuits of media, so they're not actually asking questions about other things that are going on. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't, reap, mythological and sacred data or inspiration from wherever you can get it. But there's also reasons to question the places that society has elected for church to happen, and to bring the state, or to ask state-like questions in that church, and on the other side, to go into the state thing and to go, okay, where's the sacred here? Mm-hmm. Where's the myth operating here? What are these myths in these other zones? So that's also part of the key, but it's not collapsing them into one. Mm-hmm. It's just recognizing that we're constantly negotiating the borderline between various modes, and to try to become someone who is comfortable with that.
100%. And, we're going to wrap it up soon because I want to respect your time. But, hearing everything, and from the beginning, this conversation has been about modes, the inside and the outside, the poetic and the empirical, subjective truth, objective truth, consensus reality and your own reality, your own experience, church and state, and the analogy of government works better when we separate church and state, and we'd have to make sure that we keep our modes separate, but knowing that they occasionally bleed into each other. And I would go so far as to say that intuitively, I think that's been my way of resolving existential angst as much as possible for now. We'll see when I'm 80 years old and I can no longer deny one of the modes. but for now, look, I know that I need to eat 3 times a day. I know that I need to go to the bathroom and metabolize food. I know that I need to lie down in a bed 8 hours and fucking go to sleep. There are things that are non-negotiable in one mode. In fact, they're nourishing. Sleep and food are nourishing. But what's also equally necessary and nourishing for me is to have mythopoetic and aesthetically oriented nourishment. So I need to listen to music that makes me cry. I need to disappear or lose track of my own boundaries when I watch a movie. I need experiences of absolute immersion or absolute unmixed attention, what Weil calls, which is a form of prayer, where I disappear. Diana Slattery's idea that all interpersonal transformation, education, or persuasion takes place when you are completely absorbed in something. And so for me, the mythopoetic is a chance to surrender all agency into some construct, some aesthetic construct that will carry me away towards ecstasis, catharsis, and communion, as Jamie Wheel says. And that, as long as I know what I need, I'm okay. Do you know what I'm saying? In both modes. Know what you need in every mode. And I feel like that's a way of finding the closest thing you can to harmony.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's also just part of it.
Seems like you do it too, because with all you grapple, how come you're not a paranoid mess? You know what I'm saying? With all you grapple, your basic disposition and demeanor is hey, bro, you're chill.
Yeah, no, because I have a lot of practices behind me, because I pay a lot of attention to food, to diet, to exercise, to meditation, to yoga, to reading and listening to those things that inspire me or that allow me to move through that. So what I do intellectually or in terms of my expression is just part of the way that I navigate my life. And I don't really think of myself as the guy who's thinking all these things. I'm this other guy who does all this, who has this life, and I'm doing all these things and whatever, and a relationship, really working on that. And, it's easier now. When I was younger, I was much, much more, angsty, way more angsty, very, anxious, worried, depressed, the full gamut of, sensitive neurology kind of approach. And, but I took that as encouragement to develop practices that would enable me to be more steady, to develop my own kind of center of gravity. So if we're both, if we're all just falling through the void and there's no ground, well, there is something like a center of gravity that you carry.
That's right.
You learn that if you're like running down the mountainside, you're like, wait, how am I not just falling apart? Well, because I'm actually kind of moving it with my own body. You do Tai Chi, you're like moving your energy center around your center of gravity. And so there's a way of living that way too, without the expectation of totally solid ground, and yet being grounded in your practice and even in the regularity of practice and what that gives you. So there's a whole other side of me where I could just be talking about meditation and practices or whatever, and I've just chosen to not. I talk about it more now than I used to.
Yeah.
But it's taken me a long time. I mean, I'm in my 50s, and it's gotten better, way better.
Yeah.
But it took a long time. When I was a young person, it was much more challenging to be me.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, it feels like in the end, there's got to be this intention of, for whatever it is, I'm gonna make it work for me. I'm gonna come up with a way of making it work for me. Like as long as the keep the neurosis at bay, have rationalizations that are useful but not pathological, stay somewhat open but remain grounded, have flights of fancy but make sure you eat so you don't have a manic episode. Like, it's like make it work for you. And I hope that people can develop those intuitive muscles to figure out a way of how to play their note,
Yeah, great.
So, Erik Davis, thank you.
All right, sir, it was great.
Dude. Any closing remarks or places you want to send our audience to? TechGnosis.com.
Yeah, I mean, I still just crank it out there, and High Weirdness is going to be out in paperback in September, and it's doing really well. People like it. It's challenging but rewarding. So if you like a challenge that's rewarding, it's probably for you. You know what I mean? So
Beautiful.
So I'm just still talking about that.
And just one more question, because I just remembered I wanted to ask you this. Where do you stand on synchronicity? And
Whoa,
serendipity?
dude! It's like,
is that too
like
much?
we get to the end and you're like, oh wait, I got this little, I got this can. Oh, it's full of worms. Oh, here they are. They're all on the table.
Okay, fair enough. That could be for part two.
No,
some other
I'll
time.
give you the brief. No, you asked it, so I'll just throw in.
Okay,
a few,
please,
like,
because you wrote an essay on Burning Man that I loved called Beyond Belief, and you talked about the demolition derby of reality constructs colliding on a parched void. You talked about pocket universes and the juxtaposition of those pocket universes. You talked about evanescent lightning bolts of meaning in the perceiver's mind. And then finally, and I'll never forget this, you said that the juxtaposition is the formal operating space of synchronicity.
Yes.
And I use synchronicity and serendipity interchangeably. So if you like, take a few minutes. And
yeah,
close
well,
it.
just okay. I'll close
Yeah.
on this one. Just it came up recently with another conversation. One sort of point to make about synchronicity is if we experience them a little bit, have one, maybe one the next day, whatever. It usually feels pretty good, even if they're slightly
That's right.
ominous.
Yeah.
It feels like there is some deeper mystery
Sure.
to things, or I'm on the right path,
Yeah.
or the spirits are. We go into magical thinking. We're like, we have to. We have there's no place to avoid
right.
a little bit of magical thinking.
For sure.
And it's almost like psychedelic grace. The idea of Christian grace is that it's nothing that you do.
Yeah.
God gives it to you. You have no control over it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. You're sitting there, you're doing your life, and like, whoa, there's this remarkable set of this event of serendipity. But if you just have those same experiences more frequently, like way more frequently, you're psychotic.
Yeah.
So, and I say that not to say that synchronicity is an indication of psychosis at all.
Yeah.
It's that with synchronicity, as well as so many other domains of altered states and marginal forms of consciousness and spiritual this and trance that and magic this and all that kind of stuff, it's a spectrum. Yeah. And in some ways, it's a spectrum at the far end of which is psychosis or other forms of extreme mental distress.
Right.
But without investigating that spectrum, I think our lives are incredibly dry.
Right.
And
also people don't have to worry about that spectrum being there, because a spectrum can have a range enough to almost be like a change in kind.
Yeah.
You know, like water turning into vapor. There's a spectrum, but then there's a temperature when water turns into vapor. So there's still the same material molecule, so to speak. So I would say that it's very similar in that spectrum. You know,
Yeah.
Like, people shouldn't worry if they
No,
have
no,
just the
no.
right amounts of synchronicity at regular times that they're psychotic. But certainly when somebody's doing way too many psychedelics and then they become convinced that they are Jesus Christ and then they end up in a psych ward, you know, that's when connecting the dots, when seeing more patterns becomes patternicity. Isaiah Berlin, to understand is to perceive patterns, right? But seeing too many patterns everywhere when everything is meaningful, well, now you're psychotic. I mean,
Right. That's it. So you're it's always walking a tightrope. You know, it's always a balancing act. It's always a middle path. You know. And then the other thing to say about synchronicities that I think is really important is to focus. It's the same kind of message I've been saying. Is to focus on the actual phenomenological experience of encountering the sense, the deeply intuitive, powerful sense that there's some other order of reality or meaning. Yeah. But don't attempt to understand what that other order of reality actually might mean. That's partly the way that you build a psychotic response. And instead, synchronicities are both revelations and veilings at the same time, because they're pointing to some other order of reality that's orchestrating all this. But you don't get to see that other order of reality. All you see is the orchestration. And to me, that's what it is. It's the simultaneity of this revelation with a veiling.
Wow, that's so good, dude. Write that one down, man. Wow. But then
Put that in your pipe and smoke
totally.
it.
Do people have any agency over creating more conditions for synchronicity?
Well,
George Carlin
absolutely.
talks about psychocybernetics, you know, like priming your brain, thinking something, writing it down, reading what you've written, and then all of a sudden you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And so you can prime your brain to heighten serendipity to get you achieve your goals, because the brain is a pattern-seeking machine, goal-oriented
Absolutely.
behavior. So it's like, well, play with the program, like play with the revelation and the veiling to suit your needs in the world, as long as those needs are additive to the community and to the planet, and to, you know, allow you to make a contribution. You know, if you have the right values, like that's kind of cool.
Or
People go
you
to Burning Man for those.
I was going to say,
serendipities.
you set up environments like Burning Man where there's a lot of material, a lot of room for random juxtaposition, a lot of room for resonance and overtones, where you pile on associations. Where, you know, there's the whole space is like a cannabis association machine where everything is connected with everything else. Totally. So then you're going to have more of those kinds of experiences. I think that's partly why cognitively it's so refreshing to go to festivals. It's not just we have fun or that we press our boundaries or that we can socialize in a kind of quasi-utopian space where we can leave a lot of the normal bullshit aside. I think it's also cognitively stimulating and refreshing to sort of be in an environment where these things are kind of happening without our will, or you know, we set them in motion in that way. So I think that's a really can be a very tasty way of nourishing that side of ourselves that needs that sense of magic.
Needs that church, man. It needs that church. Oh God, I could talk to you forever. Do you mind if I just share one more anecdote? It's about cannabis. And, you know, Michael Pollan, in the beginning of his book, How to Change Your Mind, says that one of the nice things about cannabis as a tool, and I would say a tool for an entry point for the more church-like mythopoetic realms, is that it, he says, and he says beauty and travel can do this too, is that it knocks all signals forwards and backwards. The automatic thing that the brain does of taking data from the present, comparing it with data from the past, and using that to predict the future. The been there's and seen that's of the adult mind. And that cannabis, through its short-term memory disruption and breaking the flow of time into discrete present moments, knocks all signals forwards and backwards, dropping you into the flow of the present, a present that is literally wonder-full, because wonder is the byproduct of that unencumbered sense of first sight, to which the adult brain has typically closed itself. And the unencumbered sense of first sight you can only have if your brain can't recall exactly what this is like or what it is going to be. And so you're encountering the world with a virginal noticing. And so when you put yourself in that state, you're highly suggestible and highly malleable to stimuli, because your defenses are down and you're quick leapfrogging to the future and to the conclusion. And so in the combination of something like cannabis with a festival, with a movie, with listening to music, with toolkits and or constructions around you that also are working with the cannabis to create a portal into the church, into the sacred or the poetic. I just think it's a great tool for it. And now that it's legal, it's just like, as long as people can keep those lines and modes divided, what a great little lubricant to facilitate.
I've been really interested in exploring the overlap between cannabis and meditation. Small doses of cannabis, just a little bit to sort of allow that zone in, and what it supports and what it doesn't support from like a more serious, straight meditation kind of perspective. Yeah. And one of the places it supports, I believe, is precisely in the ability to be present to phenomenological flow states. Yes. And for me, I know that if I get stoned and go see a crappy science fiction movie, I'm going to have all sorts of marvelous experiences. Yes. And like even that whole thing about Contact earlier with the Christian and so like I was stoned, so I was like, oh man, see, it's like it's the Zen versus but it's it's in the movie, but it's sort of not, whatever. It's an associational thing. Probably the director might not have thought about it at all. Doesn't matter, but I find much more satisfying and more church-like is really just the ability to be in the present flow of a moment with just ordinary sensation. I mean, I'm very Zen that way. So I recall in particular one time where I was listening. I was at the beach down near Santa Barbara, and it was night. And we were stoned, and my friends were off doing something else. And I just sat there and I listened to the waves crashing. And I was particularly noting the way that, as the waves crash, it really defines the sort of space of sound, because it's over here in the left part of the field, and then it traces a line over here to the right, and then it just does it again. And I became aware that by being in the space of sound and then allowing this event to take place through the space, it was almost like I was surfing it, because I was actually kind of my attention was riding the line of this marvelous, rich sound of all these overtones and qualities. And I was absolutely absorbed. There was no thought of anything else. Right. I'm not hungry. I don't need a beer. I'm not, what am I going to do tomorrow? And and so in my experience, cannabis can really support those things for a certain period of time. Correct. And then there's ways in which it distorts and kind of lacks clarity, so that you can't kind of always I can't get back, and now I'm back, and now I have the munchies, and it's like of course it doesn't give you the whole thing, but it gives you these moments or these passages that are worth the price of admission for sure.
I built my whole life around those passages. Those are there for me. That's the mythopoetic, but very stewarded. Yeah. Because I, just like music is a structured envelope of sound, I'm innately a director. Like, so innately, as soon as I became aware that this is a tool that makes me more suggestible, it also means that I can steward really well thought of, structured input signals when I'm in those suggestible states, because then I can bypass my brain's been there's and seen that, and I can hurl myself into delightful mind-body states of hyperpresence, which normally is very hard for me. Yeah. And so that's really nice, because it's like once I'm there, I know how to get there. I know how to pick the place, how to pick the right people, how to do all the things that when you remember, like your creative and linguistic choices shape your experience. And that's the first thing you notice when you're in an altered state. You're like, oh, I love how this song makes me feel. Oh man, I really love the company of this person. Oh man, this landscape is so inspiring, isn't it? I'm like, oh, that also means that I have agency by picking this person and picking this song and picking this environment. Like, oh, I can construct these types of flows in the present very intentionally. And that's nice, because it's like I've made my own church with my own rituals.
There you go.
Yeah. Anyway. Thanks, brother.
All right, man.
Appreciate you, man.
Thank you.
Treat. What a treat.